Henry died on July 6, 1189, bitter, defeated, and betrayed by his own sons. His last remaining son, Richard, had allied with the King of France against him. When Henry was shown the list of those who had turned against him, Richard's name was at the top. Henry died the same day, turning his face to the wall in what even hostile chroniclers called despair. He was 56 years old. He had been brilliant, brutal, and in the end, alone. Richard, Eleanor's great favorite, her lion-hearted boy, became King of England immediately. And one of his very first royal acts, within days, possibly within hours of his father's death, was to send word to Winchester that his mother was to be freed. Not merely freed, freed immediately, freed with full honors, and given extraordinary in any era the authority to act in his name. What Eleanor did next has no real parallel in medieval history. In the months between Henry's death and Richard's coronation, she effectively governed England. At 67 years old, after 16 years of imprisonment, riding from town to town across the kingdom, she ordered the release of political prisoners from jail in every England. She reformed the oppressive forest laws. She received oath of loyalty in Richard's name. She was the de facto regent of England, and she performed the role with the ruthless competence of someone who had been doing this in her head for 16 years, waiting for the moment it would matter. Richard was in many ways Eleanor's greatest project, and her most complicated one. He was magnificent in battle, legendarily brave, and an inspiring commander, and utterly uninterested in the administrative details of running a kingdom. He spoke French, not English. He spent perhaps 6 months of his entire 10-year reign actually on an English soil. In his own lifetime, Richard was celebrated as the ideal warrior king. From a managerial standpoint, it was a disaster, and Eleanor knew it. In 1190, Richard departed for the Third Crusade, the great expedition to retake Jerusalem from Saladin. The crusade would occupy him for years. Before leaving, he needed an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of military equipment, and critically, a bride. Richard was unmarried and childless. Eleanor, 68 years old, decided to personally solve this problem. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in the winter of 1190 to 1191, crossed the Pyrenees mountain range in winter. In winter, rode through Castile and Navarre, personally negotiated the betrothal of her grandson's suitable bride, then escorted the young woman, Berenguela of Navarre, across the Alps to Sicily, where Richard was staging his crusade. She then sailed across the Mediterranean at 68 in the 12th century. For context, the average life expectancy in 12th century Europe was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. Eleanor was nearly 70, had survived imprisonment, war, 2 dissolving marriages, and the death of multiple children, and she was crossing the Pyrenees in winter to arrange a royal wedding. The people she met along the road must have assumed she was a legend traveling in human form. Richard's Third Crusade was, unlike the second, a military success of sorts. He could not retake Jerusalem, but he secured Christian access to the city and won several brilliant tactical victories against Saladin. The great warrior king then made the journey home, and here, fate delivered its most theatrical blow. Richard, disguised as a pilgrim, was recognized and captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had mortally offended during the crusade, and handed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who promptly announced a ransom. Eleanor, at 70, looked at the ransom demand and did what Eleanor of Aquitaine always did. She got to work. She organized the collection of a kingdom-wide ransom tax. She pressured the Pope, the bishops, the nobles. She wrote letters to devastatingly logical and emotionally compelling that modern scholars still read them with admiration. She threatened, she pleaded, she reasoned, and when French King Philip, Richard's nominal ally, now scheming with Richard's treacherous brother John to keep Richard imprisoned, tried to bribe the emperor to the extent the captivity, Eleanor counter-maneuvered him at every step. While Eleanor organized the ransom from London, her youngest son John, the famous John Lackland, the future King John of Magna Carta infamy, was busy trying to steal everything that was not nailed down. He made alliances with the French king. He bribed Castellans to surrender their castles. He announced at one point that Richard was dead, which was not true, and therefore he, John, should be considered king. It was not subtle. Eleanor moved against John with strategic precision. She shuttled between castles along the Welsh border and the southern coast, reinforcing loyalty, appointing new governors, cutting off John's funding wherever she could find it. She called councils, issued writs, applied pressure. She was managing an active political insurgency while simultaneously raising a ransom and corresponding with the Pope. This was not the behavior of a 70-year-old grandmother. This was the behavior of a seasoned general. The recorded details of Eleanor's castle defense are tantalizing in their brevity. We know she was present at key fortifications during the crisis of 1193 and 1194. We know she spoke to garrisons. We know castles that seemed ready to surrender did not surrender when Eleanor arrived. She was said in those halls what arguments were made, what combination of royal authority and personal force of will kept those walls standing. These are lost to time, but the outcome is recorded. The castles held. Eleanor herself carried the ransom to Germany. At 71, she sailed up the Rhine to the imperial court of Mainz, bearing 34 tons of silver, the greatest ransom payment in medieval European history. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI received her in his court. He had imprisoned a king. He was now looking at the king's mother, who had moved an entire kingdom to pay his price. Contemporary accounts suggest he was somewhat impressed. Richard returned to England in March 1194 to an enormous popular welcome. The reckoning with John was surprisingly mild. Richard, who was generally better at war than governance, famously told John that he was a child who had been led by evil counselors. Eleanor, who had spent a year fighting just insurgency across the kingdom, is now recorded to have shared her opinion of this assessment. But we can imagine. Richard departed for France almost immediately, embarking on the military campaigns in Normandy that would occupy the rest of his reign. Eleanor, in her 70s, continued to govern, advise, and when necessary, intervene. She was not done. Richard died in April 1199 from a crossbow to the shoulder that turned gangrenous during the siege of the minor castle of Charleroi-Chabrol, an absurd end for a man of such enormous martial glory. He was 41. Eleanor, who had survived everything, rode to be with him. She was 77 years old. She was at his side when he died. To lose Richard was to lose the great champion, her favorite, the child who had most recognized as her own. Louise's son had been French, careful, pious. Henry's son had been unpredictable and occasionally disloyal. Richard had been everything Eleanor was: brave, cultured, utterly committed, and magnificently alive in a way that filled every room he entered. Now she would have to manage John. At 78, Eleanor made one last audacious move, riding personally through the Pioneer into Castle to retrieve her granddaughter, Blanche, brokering a strategic marriage that neutralized French support for Arthur of Brittany and secured the English throne for John. It worked, as her plans tended to do. Whether John deserved it is a question history has answered with considerable skepticism. She retired to Fontevraud Abbey in 1202, took the nun's veil. Not from piety, but perhaps from a genuine hunger for the first quiet she had known in decades, and she spent her final years watching John methodically squander everything she had built, with the very attention of a master craft person watching an apprentice destroy their finest tools. Eleanor of Aquitaine died on April 1st, 1204, aged 82, older than popes, kings, and most of the ideas she has spent a lifetime contesting. She was buried at Fontevraud beside Henry and Richard. Her tomb effigy shows her eyes open. Every other royal effigy of her era shows eyes closed. Even in stone, Eleanor is paying attention. She had been twice a queen and 16 years a prisoner. She raised armies, crossed mountain ranges, organized ransoms, defended castles, arranged marriages, and patronized the arts, all in an era that insisted a woman's proper place was in quiet difference. She ignored this entirely. She outlived 2 husbands, 3 sons, and every opponent who ever tried to contain her, and she left behind a civilization measurably shaped by her hands. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.